You've never truly been alone. Since birth, they've tried to fill every silence, stifle every pause with noise and promises of affection. They gave you toys when you cried, screens when you were bored, and relationships when you were afraid. Solitude was treated as a flaw, and love as a physiological need. But what few dare to face is the brutal possibility that you may never have learned to be alone. Not because you're weak, but because you've been conditioned not to know how. The world trained you to flee from your own company as if it were a punishment. And that's exactly where the game begins. The seduction of neediness is so subtle that it disguises itself as romanticism. Movies, songs, even advice from those who love you say the same thing, that someone will come to complete you. That one day you will find your other half. That being with someone is the goal, and being alone, the punishment. But there's a profound incoherence in this discourse. Because if someone needs to be completed, it's because they are not whole. And what do you expect to build together when you haven't even built yourself? Love sold as a remedy for loneliness is in fact the anesthesia that prevents you from feeling what needs healing. Stoicism never exalted this dependence disguised as affection. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts." And what does that mean? That peace cannot come from outside. That true love, the kind that adds, not the kind that drains, is only possible when you already feel fulfilled in silence. If you can't bear your own presence, you're not ready to be present in anyone else's life. And if silence makes you desperate, then the problem was never loneliness. It was what you failed to build when it knocked on your door. Look, it's not about despising love, nor about romanticizing isolation. It's about understanding the right time for everything. The love that is born from lack is the same love that becomes a prison. He demands, charges, negotiates values, pushes you towards silent concessions that, little by little, erode your identity. Love that springs from completeness, however, is a conscious choice. It shares, it doesn't drain. It expands, it doesn't limit. But this kind of lucid and rare love isn't found when you're desperate for company. It only reveals itself when you're finally at peace with being alone. The mind conditioned to fear loneliness doesn't choose, it begs. And those who beg for affection have no criteria. They have urgency. This creates a pattern of fragile relationships where the presence of the other becomes a thermometer of self-worth. You begin to mold yourself to be accepted. You smile when you want to scream. You remain silent when you want to confront. And you wake up, months later, wondering where you went. The cruelest part is that all this seems like love, but it's just emotional survival. A silent agreement to avoid facing the discomfort of being alone. And that's why remaining single, when lived intentionally, is one of the most powerful phases someone can experience. Because it forces you to remove the crutches, facing your impulses without anyone to distract you, listening to your mind without anyone to numb it, taking responsibility for every decision without being able to shift the blame to incompatibility in the relationship. Solitude, when chosen and not imposed, becomes a laboratory for evolution. It reveals what moves you, what holds you back, what is still unconscious, and it gives you something that no one else can: clarity. It is at this stage that the strategy is born. The conscious single person is not avoiding love. They are shaping the kind of person who will never accept love out of neediness. They are training their critical eye, their emotional filter, the patience to observe before surrendering. They are not confused by premature intensity. They are not impressed by inflated promises. They do not negotiate principles for promises of affection. They have learned that being with someone out of fear of being alone is a disguised form of self-abandonment, and that whoever abandons themselves once tends to make it a pattern. Society calls this coldness, but the Stoics called it freedom. Epictetus said, "The key to freedom is the ability to say no to what enslaves you." And this includes the fear of loneliness, because when you no longer fear losing someone, you also don't sell yourself cheaply. You don't accept emotional crumbs. You don't tolerate inconsistencies that mask needs. You don't let yourself be seduced by compliments that hide manipulation. You become, in the deepest sense of the word, invulnerable to emotional games. Not because you don't feel, but because you don't need to. What many don't realize is that there's a kind of silent power in someone who knows how to walk alone. This person enters a room and doesn't need to prove anything. They don't seek approval in the eyes of others. They are not there to complete themselves, but to expand. And this energy, paradoxically, is the most seductive of all, because it carries a rare truth, that of someone who was already self-sufficient before being chosen, that of someone who has already built roots before offering shelter, that of someone who is not needy for attention, but available for connection. But be warned, this is not about arrogance. It's not about despising relationships or isolating oneself as a shield. It's about understanding that love, when born from completeness, has a completely different strength. It doesn't demand, it doesn't suffocate, it doesn't condition, it doesn't engage in identity negotiations to survive. It simply is, because it was chosen, not begged for. Because it was built from two whole individuals, not two halves, searching for emotional glue. And that's only possible when the time spent single was lived with depth, not with anxiety. The world will call you cold. They'll say you're too demanding. They'll try to convince you that you're wasting your time. But what they don't know, or don't have the courage to admit, is that there's a maturity that only arises in silence, a clarity that only emerges when you stop running from yourself, a criterion that is only built when you're no longer negotiating with the fear of being alone. Staying single is therefore the phase in which you discover who you are, so that only then can you decide who is worth being with. What truly imprisons you isn't iron shackles, but the silent pacts you make with fear. The fear of disappointing, of losing, of being left behind. These invisible pacts shape entire routines. You wake up at times you don't want to, go where you don't want to, say things you don't believe, all to keep someone close. And the worst part is you call it love. But the right name is dependence. It's an emotional prison where you are both jailer and prisoner at the same time. And the hardest cell to escape is the one where you believe you are safe. Neediness never comes disguised as weakness. It masquerades as sweetness, dedication, surrender. But neediness isn't surrender. It's a desperate exchange. I'll give up a little of myself as long as you don't leave. This sounds romantic, but it's a contract of self-sabotage. You begin to mold your behaviors so as not to lose someone. You begin to give in where there was once conviction. You start walking in the opposite direction from your own essence to keep an illusion alive. And the cruelest part is that all of this is taught as a virtue. As if loving too much were beautiful, even if it costs you yourself. Seneca said that no wind is favorable to him who does not know where he is going. And when your inner compass is replaced by the expectations of others, any breeze becomes a storm. You lose your axis, you lose your sense of direction, you lose your way, and you start living to please, to yield, to maintain. But maintain what? A bond that only exists because you can't imagine your life without the other person? That's not love. That's fear dressed as affection. And while that fear governs your decisions, you don't live, you survive emotionally. That's why the single phase, when well lived, is not a hiatus, it's a reinauguration, a return to the center, a reunion with your compass. When you remain single by choice, not by circumstance, you begin to realize where there was excess, where there was escapism, where there was emotional submission disguised as loyalty. You begin to reclaim possession of yourself. And that is more than liberating. It's transformative, because once you experience the taste of total autonomy, everything that smacks of emotional dependence begins to repulse you. This autonomy begins in the details. The day you refuse an invitation simply because you don't want to go, without needing to justify it, without fear of seeming indifferent. The moment you wake up and your first decision isn't, what will the other person think, but what brings me closer to what I believe in. Autonomy is not the absence of ties. It's the presence of direction. It's when you become the protagonist of your own story again, no longer a supporting character in someone else's narrative. And it is in solitude that this autonomy is consolidated, because there are no distractions or external voices shaping your steps. When you are alone, you no longer need to negotiate time with someone. You invest time in something. Your focus ceases to be pleasing. It becomes building. And that changes everything, because you start to strengthen habits that were previously stifled by compromises. You start taking care of your body not to attract someone, but because your health has become a priority. You start studying not to impress, but because your intellect deserves respect. You start working with more purpose because your days now have direction, not just being busy. The big turning point is this: you stop living reactively. You stop responding to the world, and you start to architect your own path. This change in attitude has a cost. You need to face boredom. You need to look in the mirror on days when no one validates you. You need to cross the silences where you previously hid behind messages and effective confirmations. But that's the price of freedom. Marcus Aurelius said that what is in your power should be enough. And being alone reveals, with brutal honesty, how much of your peace depends on you, and how much still depends on others. The discipline that is born in this environment is like tempered steel, because it doesn't arise from comfort. It arises from the daily confrontation with your own impulses, with your escapes, with your justifications. When there is no one to serve as a mirror, you are forced to see yourself without filters, without convenient praise, without excuses. You begin to realize which attitudes sustain your peace and which sabotage it. You begin to say no firmly, without fear of seeming harsh. Because you understand that every poorly given yes is one more inch further from yourself. And this discipline overflows. It appears in how you manage your routine, your money, your health. It appears in your ability to keep your word even when no one is watching. It appears when you choose to sleep early instead of being distracted by empty conversations. When you prefer a book to a notification, when you opt for growth instead of validation. This type of discipline, forged in solitude, creates a foundation that no romance can replace, because it wasn't born to replace, it was born to sustain. And here's the point that few understand. You're not becoming cold, you're becoming clear. Clarity is mistaken for insensitivity by those who live emotionally dependent lives. But those who have spent enough time with themselves learn that true peace is the fruit of inner coherence, that there is no more solid pleasure than living towards what you believe in, that there is no healthy bond when it demands the mutilation of one's own essence. Solitude then ceases to be absence and becomes a compass. Not for those who flee from love, but for those who no longer accept negotiating themselves for it. There is a passage from Epictetus that summarizes this philosophy in an almost brutal way. If you want to improve, be prepared to be ridiculed. And that's exactly what happens when you take the reins of your own life. People don't understand why you don't give in anymore, why you seem so selective, why you don't respond with the same emotional speed as before. But they haven't seen the process. They haven't witnessed the days of silence, the internal confrontations, the reconstruction you experienced in silence. They only see the result. They label as coldness what is, in fact, lucidity. At that point, your life changes course. Your projects stop revolving around someone else's expectations. Your decisions become bolder. You change cities, careers, circles, because now you have the clarity to perceive what is stagnating you. You no longer seek the comfort of the predictable. You seek the challenge of growth. And when you look back, you realize you haven't lost anything. You've only abandoned what held you back. Autonomy then ceases to be a pretty speech and becomes your new normal. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all is this. You stop blaming others, exes, friends, the system. You acknowledge that everything you accepted was your own choice, that every time you gave in beyond what was healthy, it was out of fear of being alone, that every toxic pattern maintained was fueled by your own insecurity. This self-responsibility hurts, but it's liberating, because if you created the prison, you can also build the way out. And the key has always been in the same place, in your willingness to walk alone until you are ready to choose consciously. Single then, you are not adrift, you are in control. And that makes you dangerous. Because the world doesn't know how to deal with someone who can't be manipulated for fear of losing. You become rare, because you're not trying to fit in, you're trying to evolve. And at this stage, you don't seek relationships, you attract encounters. And you only connect with what respects your direction, not with what tries to divert it. Your path aligns with your purpose, and everything that doesn't add up automatically distances itself. This is mastering your own path. a state where you no longer ask, will they like me? But rather, does this still represent me? Where you don't trade dreams for companionship, where the absence of the other no longer defines your presence, and where each step is guided by conviction, not by neediness. It is at this point that the single phase becomes not only strategic, but sacred, because it was there that you stopped molding yourself to please others and began transforming yourself to grow. Something changes when you stop waiting to be chosen. When applause ceases to be your compass and the approving gaze of others no longer determines your direction. At that moment, relationships stop being emotional salvation and become what they should have been from the beginning: conscious choices. And the most curious thing is that, by ceasing to chase after someone, you begin to see who is truly coming to meet you, not out of self-interest, not out of projection, but out of truth. Most people enter relationships driven by a silent desire for validation. They want to be chosen to finally feel worthy, seen, important. But when this desire guides your choices, you become vulnerable to the most subtle emotional manipulation, the one that feeds on your fear of not being enough. You ignore red flags, romanticize empty promises, interpret attention as depth. And in this distortion, you give the most valuable access in your life to someone who did nothing to deserve it. They only appeared when you were vulnerable. The Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus taught that no good can come from a choice made out of weakness. And this phrase, forgotten by so many, is a map for relationships. The impulse to fill the void quickly is always emotionally costly. Because when you become attached too early, you don't observe. You idealize. You don't see who the person really is. You see what you need to see to avoid feeling alone. And this is the kind of illusion that exacts high interest over time. You feel deceived, but it was you who chose to see little. The time spent single with lucidity heals this. It transforms the desire to be chosen into the courage to choose. And this transition is silent. One day, you simply realize that you no longer feel that urgency to prove yourself. That you no longer need to post, show off, perform. That if someone enters your life, they are welcome, but if they leave, it doesn't break you down. This kind of maturity is rare because it requires crossing the desert of solitude without getting lost in the mirages of neediness. And when you cross it, something precious happens. Your standards rise. You begin to observe what you previously ignored. The tone of voice that reveals control, the gesture that demonstrates respect, the silence that betrays disinterest. You stop romanticizing potential and start respecting reality. And it's not because you've become cold. It's because you've finally understood that your peace is non-negotiable. That presence by itself is no longer enough. That attention without consistency is just another distraction. And that premature intensity is almost always a disguise for a lack of depth. In this new stage, connection ceases to be a need and becomes a privilege. Something rare, built slowly, sustained by values, and not by urgency. You begin to allow access not for charm, but for consistency. Not for chemistry, but for coherence. And this confuses those who still live in needy mode. They accuse you of being too selective, too distant, too demanding. But what they don't understand is that you've already known silence. You've already befriended your own company. You've already built an inner fortress. And therefore, you no longer accept entering into relationships that require you to dismantle yourself to fit in. Seneca, another forgotten Stoic, said that bad company corrupts slowly, almost imperceptibly. And it's true. A disrespect here, a negligence there, a subtle insistence that you compromise your boundaries. Almost imperceptibly, you begin to lose yourself. And when you wake up, you no longer recognize your own voice, your posture, your choices. That's why solitude becomes a silent filter. It doesn't distance you from what is true. It only prevents what is shallow from approaching. When you develop this lens, you realize that most of the connections that once fascinated you were merely a reflection of your haste to cling. And now, without that haste, you begin to observe patiently. You allow time to reveal character, silence to show intention, and coexistence to bring truth to light. And in this new configuration, each new relationship is tested not by emotion, but by ethics. Not by the pleasure it brings, but by the kind of person you become alongside it. You are not incomplete. You are in formation. While most rush to fill the void with fragile connections, you are making the rarest move, strengthening yourself from within. The single phase, when well lived, is the terrain where true power is cultivated. It's where you learn to become irresistible without depending on anyone's approval. Because the man who masters himself masters the game. But mastering yourself is only the first step. The second is mastering the other. And for that, you need to understand what truly activates desire, what provokes fascination in seconds, what makes someone see you as an impossible to ignore presence. And that's where the next level comes in. The Forbidden Manual: How to Trigger Desire in 60 Seconds. This is not a book about cliches or stage tricks. It's a direct, dense, and relentless audiobook, revealing the most effective psychological triggers to activate desire almost instantly, using invisible laws that govern attention, attraction, and social behavior. What you'll find there isn't theory. It's weapon, it's method, it's mastery. If you're ready to stop just reacting and start influencing. If you want to transform your solitude into magnetic social power. If you want to be the man who doesn't need to beg, but who is chosen because he doesn't need to be. Then this manual is your next step.